Do you want to start making sourdough but don't want the commitment of doing a starter? This video is going to be perfect for you. So what we're going to be making is some incredible loaves of bread that end up tasting amazing, and you can probably apply the principles that you learn in this video to any bread recipe to give your recipes a little bit of extra flavor in that yeast development. So making sourdough bread or any baked item is a lot more about the technique that you use than the actual recipe, because pretty much all baking recipes are a combination of a very limited number of ingredients. So the order in which you add things and how long you let things sit at different stages can make a huge difference in the way that works. To change the final product, a few changes in the way those ingredients are added are going to change the end product completely. For example, a bread recipe has almost the same ingredients as a cake recipe or as a cookie recipe. It's just the ratios are different and the technique is different. By changing those ratios of ingredients, we have an endless list of products with just a few ingredients that you can keep in your house. So that's why baking is such a great way to play around with cooking without a huge investment of price. To add a little bit of extra flavor to any yeast product, you can start out by making a starter. And this starter is going to be a really quick one that you don't have to let sit for days and days and days. We're just doing a little bit to develop that flavor. A starter is a really loose mixture of flour, sugar, and yeast, and it's going to create the perfect conditions for the yeast to grow and develop flavor, and also get a little bit of that sour tang that comes with sourdough bread. So the process of the yeast eating the sugar and releasing CO2 and alcohol is called fermentation. And you may have learned about this in biology and not fully understand that it's a part of pretty much every bread product that we make. So it's a really cool process to see that happen in the bread. To make a starter, you're going to add a third of the flour from your recipe, all of the water from your recipe, and it helps if that's a little bit warm between 110 and 120 degrees, and then a teaspoon of the yeast. So we're adding just a tiny bit of the yeast and leaving the rest out for later in the process. When you are doing any sort of baking recipe, weights are always a lot more accurate, because if you're scooping a scoop of flour, that could be much more packed depending on what mood you're in or even the different people that are measuring it. So weights are a way to overcome that. So you're going to mix together those ingredients and let them sit for 8 to 12 hours. And we are letting that sit at room temperature so that that yeast can convert the sugar and also get a little bit of the sourdough flavor. So in the time lapse that we're watching right here, you can see the yeast acting and moving over the 12-hour period. And this was overnight, so you can start seeing it moving around and starting to do some things in that mixture and some bubbles forming at the top. So after the 12 hours, you're going to place that bowl back on the mixer, and you are going to grab your dough hook. So that's the one that literally looks like a hook. So then you are going to take the remaining part of your flour, and once again we're weighing that, and then all of your other ingredients for the recipe. And it is really important that you not forget salt, because salt is going to check the growth of that yeast and make sure it doesn't go overboard. And notice that we are adding the remaining part of the yeast as well. Then you're going to turn the mixer on and mix it until it's fully combined and looks kind of like one big shaggy mess. And then you might need to adjust your flour amounts, because as you can see, it's a little sticky at the bottom. Also, like I mentioned, do not forget your salt, because salt is going to slow down that fermentation process, and without it, the dough is going to rise too much in the oven and then collapse, and it's going to be very, very dense, and the texture is going to be odd because it also helps out with gluten development. So once you got your dough kind of coming together, you're going to start adding flour to adjust how much flour is in there. And you're going to need to add that until it starts to clean the sides of the bowl. And so at the end of making a yeast dough, you are going to want it to be completely clean and not very sticky. Once that dough comes together, you're going to cover it with a towel for 20 to 30 minutes just to let that gluten relax a little bit. And then we are going to turn the mixer on for 6 to 8 more minutes. And kneading the dough is going to develop gluten in the bread, and the gluten is already present in the flour that we put in there. And this is going to be working the same way that when you chew gum before you blow bubbles. It's kind of the same thing with making a yeast dough. So then you're going to lift the dough out of the bowl and grease the bowl and coat the dough with it a little bit. And this is going to prevent the skin from drying, and so that would keep it from rising very much. The oil just keeps the top from drying out. So then we are going to cover that with a towel and let it rise for 1 to 2 hours, and this is going to depend on the room temperature, the humidity, and a bunch of different things. And so it's important, sometimes it's a good idea to take a picture of the yeast rolls or the yeast dough before you start, and a higher room temperature is actually going to help it rise a little bit more. And sometimes it's a little bit hard to remember what it looked like before, so just keep in mind that you might want to take a picture of it or have like a know what mark it's up to on the side of your bowl. Yeast also prefers high humidity, so that is something to remember as well. The step that we are doing right now is called bench proofing, because you could also do this directly on the table with a towel over top of it. So I just prefer to do it in the bowl. So after you have let it rise, you're going to spread some flour on a flat surface, and bread flour works best for this because it kind of slides across the surface because of the extra protein, but you can use whatever flour that you have. Then you are going to turn the dough on the surface and fold it into thirds 2 to 3 times, and this is called punching down, and what we're trying to do is redistribute all those air pockets in the dough. So we're folding it into thirds and then folding into thirds the other way, just to kind of get all of that air out of there and redistributed. And we are not playing with this a whole lot. So then we are going to divide this into the sizes of the loaves or the rolls that you are making. So if you're making rolls, you would cut it into multiple pieces, and for this recipe, it's going to be 2 loaves of bread, and so we're just dividing it in half. So then you are going to let it sit for about 20 minutes before forming, so that the gluten relaxes and it shapes a little bit easier. Because if you cut it right away or start making it into the rolls right away, it's going to fight you a little bit because that gluten is just going to be a little bit tough. So then you're going to take each part and you're going to form it into round loaves. And to do that, you're going to pull those sides underneath until it gets nice and smooth and pretty on the top. I like to call this jellyfishing it. And then you are going to roll it on the board with the sides of your hand contacting the board, just to tighten that up into a nice little pretty loaf. And then you're going to repeat that with your other one. And that tight skin is going to keep it even so that it's going to rise nice and evenly as well. So after this, you're going to put it on an upside down sheet pan, and we're going to sprinkle that with a little cornmeal so that it doesn't stick. And we are going to let that rise until it's doubled. And you want to make sure that those are still able to move around. We're covering that with a towel. After it is risen, you are going to brush it with cornstarch water, and that's going to help a little bit with browning. And then we are going to make some relief cuts to help it rise a little bit better. And you can do this in any pattern that you'd like to, but we are using a circle of V cuts because this will end up making it look like little pretty leaves. And this does not work well with a knife. You almost have to use a razor blade to score dough like this. And there are dough scorers and stuff you can get online, but this is just a little bit cheaper and you don't have to buy a different tool. So after that, you want to make sure that your loaves are nice and loose on the pan and that they will free up from the pan. And then boil 4 cups of water and put it in an oven-safe dish on the shelf under the bread pan. And I found that a glass 9x13 dish works really, really well for this. But that water step is very, very important for this because the steam that the water makes is going to keep that crust from setting before it fully rises. And it also is going to help the crust be nice and chewy. But if we do not have the water in there, then the crust is going to set and then the dough is not going to be able to rise very much and get taller. So you're going to bake that until brown, and you also are going to measure the internal temperature of that. You want it to be 200 degrees, and this is ensuring that the water is remaining in the bread so it's not dry. If it gets to 212 degrees, all the water in the recipe is going to boil out and evaporate. So that's why measuring the internal temperature of these works really well. So you want to wait until this is fully cool to cut it, because you want the starches to fully set before you are smooshing it down. Because if you cut it when it's still warm, even though it's very, very tempting, the bread is going to collapse as you cut it. And you want to use a bread knife, so a serrated knife, to cut this up. So I hope this is a recipe that you are able to try at your house with your families. And please let us know in the comments if you tried this out. And don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, as subscribing helps us out a whole lot. Thank you so much for watching today, and keep your eye out for more videos.